Clear control, Hornet 304. Major system failure. Attempting landing clearance immediately.
No gear, no hook. 10 seconds of fuel, she still landed. The A-18 without wheels. Emily Sloane was just an observer in the backseat of the Super Hornet, her pilot dreams crushed after failing a simulation that everyone said was impossible. When Lieutenant Carter collapsed at 30,000 feet, with no landing gear, no tailhook, and fuel running out the woman they'd written off as not pilot material, calmly took control of the aircraft and prepared to prove that sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested. The morning briefing aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford was routine weather conditions, flight schedules, and safety reminders that had become background noise to most of the assembled pilots. In the back row, Cadet Emily Sloane sat quietly, with her notebook recording observations that no one would read and taking notes on procedures she wasn't allowed to perform. Sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested, she thought, repeating the phrase her father had taught her before his own F-14 had gone down over the Persian Gulf 15 years ago. The words had become her mantra during 4 years at the Naval Academy, through countless hours of studying aircraft systems that she dreamed of controlling herself. At 24, Emily had the focused intensity of someone who'd spent her entire life preparing for this moment, only to have it snatched away by a single simulation. Her academic record was flawless, her physical fitness scores were in the top 5%, and her understanding of aircraft systems was better than most instructors. But none of that mattered after the incident 6 months ago. The scent of jet fuel and salt air drifted through the briefing room's ventilation system, a constant reminder of the world she'd been barred from entering. Around her, pilots discussed weather patterns and tactical scenarios with the casual confidence of people who belonged in cockpits. Emily absorbed every word, filing away information for a future that might never come. Cadet Sloane called out Commander Patricia Hayes, the squadron's operations officer. "You'll be flying as an observer with Lieutenant Carter today. Standard training mission, nothing fancy." Emily nodded, her expression carefully neutral, despite the familiar sting of being relegated to the back seat. The Observer program was the Navy's way of keeping promising candidates in the pipeline while they decided whether to give them another chance or quietly push them toward other career fields. 6 months of watching other people live my dream, she thought, because I tried to save a simulated aircraft that everyone said was unflyable. The incident that had derailed her career was still classified, but the whispered version was simple enough. During an advanced flight simulation, Emily had attempted an emergency landing that violated every protocol in the book. The sim had been designed to be unwinnable, a test of how candidates handled inevitable failure. Emily had refused to accept defeat. She'd succeeded, but that had been the problem. The instructors couldn't explain how she'd done it, couldn't replicate her solution, and couldn't risk having a pilot who might attempt such dangerous improvisation in real aircraft. "Carter's a good pilot," Commander Hayes continued. "You'll learn a lot watching him work." Sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested. Emily repeated silently, preparing for another day of watching someone else live her dream. The A-18 Super Hornet climbed steadily through 15,000 feet, its twin engines providing the smooth, powerful thrust that Emily had dreamed of controlling since childhood. The cockpit hummed with the familiar symphony of high-performance flight, the whisper of air over control surfaces, the steady thrum of turbines, the soft electronic chimes of navigation systems. In the front seat, Lieutenant James Carter ran through the training exercise with methodical precision, his radio calls crisp and professional as he coordinated with other aircraft in the training formation. Emily could see the back of his helmet, could watch his hands move over controls she'd memorized, but never been allowed to touch. "This should be me flying," she thought, feeling the familiar ache of dreams deferred. "I know these systems better than he does. How's the view back there?" "Cadet," Carter asked over the intercom, his tone friendly, but carrying the subtle condescension that came naturally to pilots talking to non-pilots. "Outstanding, sir," Emily replied, though her attention was focused on the instrument displays and flight controls rather than the scenery. Even as an observer, she monitored every system, tracked every radio call, and mentally flew the aircraft alongside the actual pilot. The morning sun streamed through the canopy, casting sharp shadows across the instrument panel as they climbed through scattered clouds. Emily could taste the metallic tang of recycled air through her oxygen mask, could feel the subtle vibrations of the airframe as it cut through the thin atmosphere. Fuel flow is slightly high, she noted, watching the engine parameters with the obsessive attention to detail that had made her instructors nervous. Probably running a bit rich in this humidity. Nothing dangerous, but worth monitoring. The training mission was designed to test formation flying and air-to-air combat maneuver skills that Emily had mastered in simulators but had never been allowed to practice in real aircraft. She watched Carter's technique, noting areas where she might have done things differently, filing away lessons for a future that might never come. The first indication that something was wrong came as a subtle change in Carter's radio calls. His usually crisp communications became slightly slurred, his responses delayed by a few seconds that most people wouldn't notice. Emily noticed. Something's wrong. She thought her pulse quickening as she studied Carter's movements more carefully. His head position is off, and his radio discipline is degrading. "Sir," she said over the intercom, "are you feeling all right?" "Fine, cadet," Carter replied, but his voice carried a note of confusion that hadn't been there before. Just concentrating on the mission. Emily watched the pilot's movements more carefully, noting the way his head occasionally drooped forward before snapping back up. The symptoms were subtle but unmistakable to someone who'd spent years studying aerospace medicine. The gradual onset of hypoxia, oxygen starvation that could kill a pilot without warning. His oxygen system, she realized with growing alarm, her eyes moving to the life support displays. Something's wrong with his oxygen. "Lieutenant Carter, I think you should check your oxygen system," Emily said, her voice calm despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. "Oxygen's fine," Carter mumbled, but his speech was becoming increasingly slurred. Everything's normal." Emily looked at her own oxygen system display and saw the problem immediately. Carter's oxygen flow indicator was showing 0. His system had failed, and he was slowly suffocating at 25,000 feet. This is it, she thought, feeling the familiar calm that descended on her in crisis situations. This is my moment. "Sir, your oxygen system has failed. You need to descend immediately." But Carter was beyond hearing her, now his head lolling forward as hypoxia robbed his brain of the oxygen it needed to function. His hands fell away from the controls, and the Super Hornet began a gentle but inexorable climb toward even thinner air. Sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested, Emily whispered, reaching for the controls that would either save them both or kill them trying. Emily had perhaps 30 seconds before Carter lost consciousness completely, and the aircraft became uncontrollable. The emergency procedures were clear. As an observer, she was supposed to use the emergency radio to declare a mayday and hope that other aircraft in the formation could guide them to safety. But Emily had never been good at following procedures that didn't make sense. Dad would have taken control, she thought. Remembering the stories her mother had told about Captain Michael Sloane's legendary flying skills. He never let procedures get in the way of saving lives. "Lieutenant Carter, I'm taking control of the aircraft," she announced, though she knew he could no longer hear her. Emily's hands moved to the rear cockpit controls, her muscle memory taking over, despite months of being grounded. The stick felt familiar in her grip, the throttles responding to her touch like old friends welcoming her home. She'd flown this exact scenario dozens of times, and simulators had practiced emergency procedures until they were second nature. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of electrical smoke as warning lights began illuminating across the instrument panel. Emily could taste fear in her mouth, metallic and sharp, but her hands remained steady on the controls. Just like the sim she thought. Except this time, it's real, and Carter's life depends on getting it right. She pushed the stick forward to arrest the climb and began a controlled descent toward thicker air where Carter might regain consciousness. But as she scanned the instrument panel, Emily realized that their problems were just beginning. "Hornet 304, this is lead. You're deviating from formation. Report status." Emily keyed the radio, hoping it was still functional. "Lead Hornet 304. We have multiple system failures and pilot incapacitation. Cadet Sloane has control of the aircraft. The silence that followed her transmission lasted long enough for Emily to wonder if her radio had failed as well. She could imagine the shock rippling through the formation. A grounded cadet taking control of a $70 million fighter jet was the kind of situation that gave commanding officers nightmares. Let them be shocked, she thought. Carter's life is more important than their comfort zones. Hornet 3 or 4 say again. Did you say cadet has control? Affirmative lead. Lieutenant Carter is unconscious due to oxygen system failure. I'm flying the aircraft and attempting emergency descent. As Emily descended the Super Hornet toward breathable air, the cascade of system failures accelerated. The electrical malfunction that had killed Carter's oxygen supply was now affecting flight control's navigation systems and communications equipment. Warning tones filled the cockpit like an electronic symphony of disaster. The smell of burning insulation grew stronger, and Emily could see wisps of smoke beginning to curl from behind the instrument panel. She'd studied electrical fires in aircraft. They could spread with terrifying speed, consuming vital systems and filling the cockpit with toxic fumes. Focus on what you can control, she told herself. Get Carter breathing, assess the damage, find a solution. At 15,000 feet, Carter began to stir as oxygen returned to his brain. Emily had been monitoring his vital signs through the aircraft's biomedical sensors, watching for signs of recovery, while simultaneously dealing with the growing list of system failures. The sound of his labored breathing through the intercom was the most beautiful thing Emily had ever heard. What? What happened? Carter mumbled his voice, weak but coherent. Oxygen system failure, sir. You've been unconscious for about 10 minutes. I've been flying the aircraft. Carter tried to reach for the controls, but Emily could see that he was still severely impaired. Hypoxia recovery took time, and his motor skills were nowhere near adequate for controlling a high-performance aircraft. He wants to take back control, Emily realized. But he's not ready. Not even close. Sir, I need you to stay calm and let me handle the flying. Can you help me assess our system status? Carter's training kicked in, despite his condition, and he began reading through the warning displays with the methodical approach that had made him a good pilot. Emily could see his hands shaking as the scope of their problems became clear. Jesus, he whispered as the reality of their situation sank in. Electrical fire in the main distribution panel. We've lost primary flight controls navigation and... He paused his voice, taking on a note of genuine fear. Emily, the landing gear system is completely dead. Emily felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications. Without landing gear, they couldn't make a normal landing on the carrier. The tailhook system was also showing failures, which meant they couldn't catch an arresting wire, even if they could somehow get the aircraft onto the deck. No gear, no hook, she thought. Just like the simulation that got me grounded. What about fuel? She asked, though she was afraid of the answer. Fuel system is showing failures too. We're losing fuel from somewhere, and the remaining fuel is... Carter's voice trailed off as he read the display. Emily, we have maybe 10 minutes of fuel left. Sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested, Emily whispered, preparing to prove her father's words one more time. Emily's mind raced through their alternatives, each one more grim than the last. The taste of adrenaline filled her mouth as she calculated distances, fuel consumption, and the rapidly narrowing window of survival. Around them, the Mediterranean stretched endlessly blue, beautiful and utterly unforgiving. We could eject, she thought. But that means losing a $70 million aircraft and probably facing court-martial for the circumstances that led to the emergency. Emily. Carter said, his voice growing stronger as he recovered from the hypoxia. I need to take control back. This is too dangerous for... Sir, with respect, you're still impaired from oxygen deprivation. Your reaction times are compromised, and your motor skills aren't fully recovered. Carter knew she was right, but the idea of a grounded cadet attempting a carrier landing in a crippled aircraft was beyond his comprehension. The cockpit filled with the sound of his ragged breathing, the electronic warnings, and the steady whistle of air through damaged seals. He's scared, Emily realized. He's never been in a situation like this before. Emily, what you're thinking is impossible. No one has ever successfully landed a Super Hornet on a carrier without gear and hook. Actually, sir, someone has, Emily replied quietly, her father's voice echoing in her memory. In simulation, 847 Delta, 6 months ago. The scenario you're describing right now. Carter's eyes widened as he remembered the incident that had ended Emily's flight training. The impossible simulation that she'd somehow beaten using a technique that violated every safety protocol in the book. That was a simulation, Emily. This is real life. The physics are the same, sir. The aircraft responds the same way. The only difference is that this time people's lives depend on getting it right. Emily could smell the fierce sweat soaking through her flight suit, could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. But underneath the terror was something else, a cold certainty that she could do this, that her father's words were about to be proven true. Hornet 304. This is carrier control. We're tracking your emergency. What are your intentions? Emily looked at the fuel gauge, which was now showing less than 5 minutes of flying time remaining. They were 15 miles from the carrier flying a damaged aircraft with no landing gear and no margin for error. The radio crackled with static as she keyed the microphone, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Carrier control Hornet 304. We're attempting emergency landing with gear up and hook inoperative. Request emergency deck preparation. Hornet 304 negative. You are directed to eject immediately. Repeat, eject immediately. Emily looked back at Carter, who was still too impaired to make command decisions, but alert enough to understand what she was proposing. She could see the fear in his eyes, but also something else, trust. He believes in me, she realized. Even after everything, he believes I can do this. Emily, he said quietly, if you're wrong about this, we're both dead. If I'm right, sir, we both go home tonight. Sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested. Emily keyed the radio one final time, her father's words giving her strength. Carrier control Hornet 304. We're committed to landing approach. Cadet Sloane has control of the aircraft. The USS Gerald R. Ford appeared through the haze ahead, her massive deck, looking impossibly small from Emily's perspective in the crippled Super Hornet. The ship's wake cut a white line through the blue Mediterranean, and Emily could see the emergency crews scrambling on deck like ants, preparing for disaster. This is it, she thought. Everything Dad taught me, everything I've learned, comes down to the next 5 minutes. Fuel state, critical. Carter reported, his voice steadier now, but still carrying the strain of their desperate situation. We have maybe 2 minutes of flying time left. Emily could see the emergency crews scrambling on the carrier deck, foam trucks positioning themselves along the landing area while medical personnel prepared for what everyone assumed would be a catastrophic crash. The entire ship was watching as a grounded cadet attempted the impossible. Sometimes, the impossible is just another word for untested, she whispered her father's voice, as clear as if he was sitting beside her. Time to prove it, Dad. The smell of burning electronics filled the cockpit as more systems failed, but Emily's hands remained steady on the controls. She was flying on instinct, now guided by thousands of hours of study and the genetic memory of a father who had never met a challenge he couldn't overcome. I'm coming home, Dad, she thought. Both of us are coming home. The USS Gerald R. Ford grew larger in Emily's windscreen as she guided the dying Super Hornet toward its final rendezvous. The carrier's deck looked impossibly small, a narrow strip of steel surrounded by unforgiving ocean. Emergency vehicles lined the landing area like mechanical vultures, their crews preparing for what everyone expected to be a catastrophic crash. Just like the sim, Emily told herself, but her body betrayed her calm words. Sweat stung her eyes, her heart hammered against her ribs, and she could taste copper fear in her mouth. Except this time, Carter dies if I get it wrong. Emily, Carter said, his voice tight with terror. "The approach angle is too steep. You're coming in too fast." "I know, sir. Trust me." Emily was flying the aircraft at the very edge of its performance envelope, using techniques that weren't taught in any manual. The Super Hornet shuddered around them as she pushed it beyond normal limits, the airframe groaning under stresses it wasn't designed to handle. "Dad, if you're watching," she prayed silently, "help me bring us home." "Fuel showing 0. Carter reported, his voice cracking. "Engines are going to flame out any second." Emily could feel the aircraft beginning to lose power as the fuel pumps struggled to deliver the last drops of jet fuel to the engines. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of overheated electronics and the metallic taste of fear. 30 seconds, she calculated. Maybe less, before we become a very expensive glider. "Hornet 304, you're high and fast. Recommend wave off and attempt ejection. Negative control, committed to landing." The first engine flamed out as Emily crossed the carrier's wake, the sudden loss of thrust causing the aircraft to drop like a stone. She compensated by pulling back on the stick-trading airspeed for altitude in a delicate balance that required split-second timing. Feel the aircraft, she told herself, channeling every lesson her father had taught her through her mother's stories. Don't fight it, work with it. Second engine flaming out, Carter called out, as the remaining turbine wound down to silence. The cockpit fell eerily quiet, except for the whistle of wind over dead engines and the electronic warnings that continued to chime their urgent messages. Emily was now flying a 32,000-pound glider toward a moving deck with one chance to get it right. This is it, she thought, feeling her father's presence beside her. Everything comes down to the next 10 seconds. The carrier deck rushed up to meet them as Emily flared the aircraft at precisely the right moment, bleeding off airspeed while maintaining just enough forward momentum to reach the landing area. She could see individual sailors on the deck, now their faces turned upward to watch the impossible unfold. Sometimes, the impossible is just another word for untested, she whispered her father's words, carrying her through the final moments. The Super Hornet's belly touched the deck with a grinding screech of metal-on-metal sparks, flying like fireworks as the aircraft slid down the center line. Emily felt the violent deceleration throw her against her restraints, tasted blood where she'd bitten her tongue, but kept her hands steady on the controls. The Super Hornet slid 800 feet down the carrier deck before coming to rest against the crash barrier, its fuselage intact, and both occupants alive. The silence that followed was deafening. No engine noise, no warning tones, just the sound of Emily's ragged breathing and Carter's whispered prayers. "We made it," she thought, hardly daring to believe it. "We actually made it." Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft as Emily shut down the remaining electrical systems and prepared for evacuation. Through the cracked canopy, she could see hundreds of sailors and aviators who had gathered to witness what many were already calling the most remarkable carrier landing in naval history. "Emily," Carter said, his voice filled with awe and gratitude. "How did you know that would work?" Emily thought about her father, about the stories her mother had told of his legendary flying skills, about the phrase that had guided her through the darkest moments of her career. "I didn't, sir," she replied honestly. But sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested. As the canopy opened and rescue personnel helped them from the aircraft, Emily could see Commander Hayes pushing through the crowd, her expression unreadable as she approached the wreckage of the $70 million fighter jet that Emily had somehow landed without killing anyone. The smell of jet fuel and foam filled the air, mixing with the salt spray from the Mediterranean and the acrid smoke still rising from the damaged aircraft. Emily's legs shook as she climbed down from the cockpit, the adrenaline finally beginning to wear off. "I did it," she thought. "I actually did it." "Cadet Sloane," Hayes said formally, "you are to report to the captain immediately for debriefing." Emily nodded, understanding that her unauthorized assumption of aircraft control would have serious consequences, regardless of the outcome. But as she looked back at the damaged Super Hornet, She felt a deep satisfaction that no amount of disciplinary action could diminish. Dad would be proud, she thought. I proved that sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested. Mom, she said quietly, I accept full responsibility for my actions. Hayes studied her for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She smiled. Cadet, what you just did was either the most brilliant piece of flying I've ever seen or the luckiest crash in naval aviation history. Either way, we need to talk. As Emily was escorted away for debriefing, she looked back at the damaged Super Hornet one final time. The aircraft that had nearly killed them both was now a twisted wreck of metal and composite materials, but it had served its purpose. Lieutenant Carter stood beside the wreckage, his legs still shaky from the ordeal. When he caught Emily's eye, he mouthed two words that made everything worthwhile. Thank you. Sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested. Emily thought her father's words echoing in her mind as she prepared to face whatever consequences awaited her. And today we tested the impossible and won. The test pilot facility at Pax River buzzed with activity as Lieutenant Emily Sloane prepared for another day of pushing the boundaries of what naval aircraft could accomplish. Her promotion had come through 3 months earlier, along with orders to the Navy's premier test pilot school, a recognition that her innovative techniques had value beyond emergency situations. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn carrying the familiar sense of jet fuel and possibility. Emily walked across the tarmac toward the modified Super Hornet that would be her partner for today's test flight, her father's words echoing in her mind as they had every day since the emergency landing. Sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested. The Sloane maneuver, as it had become known in aviation circles, was now part of standard emergency procedures training for all Navy pilots. The technique that had once been considered impossible was being taught to a new generation of aviators who might one day need to attempt their own impossible landings. Lieutenant called out Commander Hayes, who had requested transfer to the test pilot program after Emily's vindication. We're ready for today's evaluation flight. The relationship between Emily and her former instructor had evolved from antagonistic to respectful collaboration. Hayes had publicly acknowledged her error in grounding Emily and had become one of her strongest advocates for advancement. What's on the schedule today, Mom? Emily asked, reviewing the flight plan for the aircraft that bore a small plaque near the cockpit. In memory of Captain Michael Sloane. Sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested. Emergency approach procedures in degraded visibility conditions. We're going to see if your technique works when you can't see the deck. Emily smiled, remembering the fear and uncertainty she'd felt 6 months ago when faced with an impossible situation. Now impossible was just another parameter to test and overcome. Ma'am, Emily said as they walked toward the aircraft. I've been thinking about the next phase of testing. What if we could develop techniques for landing damaged aircraft on smaller platforms? Hayes nodded, understanding that Emily's mind was always working on the next challenge, the next impossible scenario that might become possible with the right approach. Write up a proposal, Lieutenant. After what you've accomplished, I'm not inclined to call anything impossible anymore. As Emily climbed into the cockpit of the test aircraft, she felt her father's presence beside her, his words guiding her toward new horizons of possibility. Sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested, she whispered, starting the engines. Today, let's test something new.